Welcome, welcome. I think we'll get started at this point. It's so wonderful to see everyone's familiar faces and some new ones as well. Thank you so much for coming out today to today's program, Pacific Imaginaries. My name is Hedy, and I am a GYOPO comms volunteer. Today, we'll be collectively visualizing the Pacific Ocean through images, materials, memories, and beyond. We're going to take time to explore questions such as, what does the legacy of the Pacific Ocean, being an active site of resistance for generations of people fighting for sovereignty, demilitarization, and rematriation, mean for us as GYOPOs? How can we visualize, sense, and symbolize the majestic Pacific Ocean in the face of advancing militarism? How can artists, designers, and cultural workers draw from existing forms of resistance while creating new understandings of our connectivity and resilience? Before I introduce our dazzling participants, I'll say a quick word about GYOPO and our mission. GYOPO is a volunteer-powered organization with a very small staff committed to ensuring that money is never a barrier to learning about diasporic Korean art and culture. We would not be able to do any of this work without donations and the willingness of volunteers from people like you. Whether it's $10 or $10,000, no donation is too small. You can visit our website at gyopo.us and go to our donate button to ensure that GYOPO's public programs remain free. As a reminder, GYOPO is a 501c3 nonprofit and donations are tax deductible. If you're interested in volunteering with us, please scan the QR code on our sign-in sheet and we will get in touch with you. Now to introduce our participants, we are honored to have Bz Zhang, Tony Cho, and Crystal Baik leading our program today. You can find their full bios online, and I'll be presenting abbreviated versions here. Bz uses they/them pronouns and is a Chinese diasporic artist and architect based in Tovanger land, so-called Los Angeles. Through drawings, paintings, photographs, texts, objects, spaces, and maps, their work uses documentation and speculation to unravel physical and cultural constructions of place. By drawing and looking at pasts and presents of sites of extraction and migration across borders and oceans, they hope to draw forth and imagine futures beyond settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and cis-heteropatriarchy. Tony Cho uses he/him pronouns and is a Korean-American settler artist and researcher living on the unceded land of Kumeyaay territory, so-called San Diego. His creative work examines the hidden and often invisible landscapes of a militarized South Korea. Informed by community and peace organizations in South Korea, Tony asks us what it means to demilitarize ourselves and our communities. Tony has previously worked and exhibited under the name Slow Features Laboratory in many places, including the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in South Korea. Crystal Mun-hye Baik uses she/her pronouns. Professor Baik is also a feminist memory worker and associate professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Riverside, and the pedagogical lead of the University of California, Riverside Memory and Resistance Laboratory. She is the author of Re-Encounters on the Korean War and Diaspora Memory Critique, and is currently writing an intimate history of the Korean diaspora, grief, and grievance through the lens of her family experiences. She is also a beloved GYOPO former steering committee member and programs co-chair. She has stewarded many of our past programs and has helped shape GYOPO to what it is today. We are so excited to have her back with us. And without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Crystal so that we can dive into this rich presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Hedy. Can everyone hear me? I'm not going to use a mic, but just let me give you the signal or interrupt me if you can't hear me. So I just really want to thank GYOPO for holding this space. It's so just really nice to be here at this moment with all of you familiar faces and also new faces. I want to thank Kathy for just bringing us together and playing such an important role in organizing us as well, and of course Bz and Tony. So I'm just going to really provide some very brief framing remarks that I think hopefully will situate the incredible presentations from both Bz and Tony that I'm so looking forward to. So before I start, I also just really want to recognize this moment that we're in. This past year I was teaching a course at UC Riverside on feminist knowledges and sort of cultural practices, art forms, and sort of the theme every year changes. And the questions that we were really thinking through this year together, collectively, students and myself, was, what does it mean to be alive at this particular moment, right? Where it seems like so much is shaped by catastrophe, whether it's climate or militarization and war. Thinking about Korea, of course, but also Palestine and sort of different spaces, and trying to think about, what are the art forms, the cultural forms, the different kinds of language that are available to us, where we can try to register the kinds of violence that we're living through, right, albeit in different ways, but also, to capture the forms of resistance, right, and creation, sort of beyond militarization. So I was really thinking about that while I was driving here. So our first presenter is Tony. So before I shift things to him, I might just want to sort of offer some questions. So as you know from today's program description, RIMPAC, right, is an acronym for the Exercise Rim of the Pacific. And it's a multinational military exercise, right, that involves 29 nations and more than 25,000 military personnel, right? It happens biannually, and this year it's running between June and August. And of course, it's around the Hawaiian Islands. And often, sort of other names, or war games is often used as a kind of acronym as well, or a description. And I think for us, we really want to use RIMPAC as an entry point into discussing, the impact of militarization, of war, of colonialism, settler colonialism, and the ways in which the Pacific Ocean, right, has played such a crucial role, right, in sort of consolidating sort of these different forms of power, right, and violence. So when we think about the Pacific Ocean, it's often visualized, right, or imagined as a kind of empty space, right, empty space that is devoid of people. So for example, often when I think about the ways in which the Pacific Ocean is mentioned when I'm traveling, right, so my partner's family has resided in the Hawaiian Islands for several generations, so whenever we fly to Hawaii, the ocean is really described as a body of water that we're passing, right? It's sort of an aqueous passage that one has to pass to get from point A to point B, right? And unfortunately, this kind of assumption is one that has been produced, right, by different bodies of scholarship, including Asian American studies, right? Although important scholars, really the past 15 years, have really challenged this. And when I think about this, there are others, like Bernadette Gonzalez, who has mentioned sort of two distinct, but also related ways, right, that the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands, right, are understood and visualized, right? Not only by the U.S. state, but really within sort of the American social imaginary, right? So we think about through films, through popular discourse, through literature, through social media, right? So on the one hand, the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands are spaces that are actually necessary for U.S. military occupation, right? For the security of everyone else. So we can think about, for instance, the history of Guam or Guam, right, and the ways in which that has played such a crucial role. It's often referred to as sort of the tip of the spear, right, in terms of the quote-unquote beginning of sort of U.S. empire, right, and the ways in which sort of indigenous Chamorro people have been displaced. But think about how that displacement has been deemed as necessary, as unfortunate but necessary, right? But also we can think about the ways in which, especially like Hawaii, right, is imagined as a place of vacation, of leisure, of holiday, right, as a kind of tropical paradise, right, that one can sort of visit at any time, right? So again, these sort of twin images, right, that might seem conflicting, but they're actually related, right? Again, as a place to militarize for security, but also as a place of vacation, right, tropical paradise. So I think there are really, really important ways, and I want to really honor this, the ways in which Pacific Islander, indigenous scholars, artists, writers, especially feminists, have long contested this, right? These kinds of violent assumptions, right? They really foreground the multiplicity, the plurality, and the sovereignty, right, of Pacific Islander peoples and spaces, right? And the ocean is alive. You know, it's an ancestor, right? It's a part of our daily lives. It's diverse. It's filled with different kinds of life forms that stretch beyond the human, right? Which is really important, right? So some folks that I can think about is Miley Arvin, Hanani K. Trask, Keith Camacho, Alfred Flores, Teresa Tauea, Ayana Ginoza, and among many others who have written about this. So given this context, I thought that we could be in conversation with our incredible practitioners here today, and also just keep this in mind, right, as you're thinking about this. And I'm so sorry, I meant to say at the beginning of my presentation that you'll see that there's paper and markers or sort of watercolors at each of your tables. So feel free to doodle, to draw while we're talking. You don't have to wait until we're in discussion mode. One thing that I want to also flag is I think at certain tables there's paint. So just be mindful that the paint might bleed beyond sort of the paper. And there's actually extra paper right here on newsprint that you can use to layer if you need to. So I should have mentioned that at the beginning. But here are the questions that we can think about collectively together as we hear and listen to and learn from our practitioners here today. So when you hear the words Pacific Ocean and Pacific Islands, what are the images, the sounds, the histories of figures that come to mind for you, right? What immediately sort of pops up? And how might these kinds of images or forms of representation, right, no matter how seemingly innocuous or harmless, maybe resonate, right, with the ways that the Pacific Ocean is formulated as a kind of empty space of passage, as a militarized space, or as a tropical paradise, right? And we're sort of here collectively in a space of unlearning, right? Not just learning, but also unlearning together. And then what other ways of visualizing, of imagining might we draw on, right? Not just to counter or dismantle, right, this kind of violent imagery, but to also offer different alterities, right? And to center life forms, again, human, but also beyond human, abundance, safety for all, sustainability, right? What are the tools, the strategies, the languages, the technologies that we need to create or that might already exist, but we need to sort of reconfigure or appropriate to sort of think about this? What is the connection or relationship between political activism and cultural representations, right? So for instance, architecture, right? And then finally, as people who are a part of different diasporas, right? Sort of living in Turtle Island, right, as settlers, how have our everyday experiences and the experiences of our ancestors, our peoples, and this is a question I've been thinking a lot about as I've been writing about my family, or how they've been impacted by harm and violence, right? Militarization, colonialism, brutality. But also, are there ways in which we might have been, we are complicit, right, in perpetuating harm and violence, even unintentionally, right? And how might we acknowledge this and move from a place of radical solidarity and love, right, as we try to activate, but also, again, enact beyond and against, right, U.S. militarism. So with that said, I'm going to segue into to Tony, and we're going to play musical chairs so you can switch. The Tony Cho.
I think there are mics behind us.
Okay, I'm just going to wait for the presentation to turn on.
And while we're waiting, just thank you so much for that table setting and framing. It's a really big conversation, and maybe one thing I'll add as we're waiting is how much gratitude I think we're coming into the space with. There's been so many conversations that have fed into this one. I'm actually seeing a lot of faces in the room that have been part of those conversations. And one of the things that was important to us was understanding like there are as many conversations with this title and program description as there are folks who are coming from the Pacific, right? So this is very much we're going to be kind of trying to practice how Crystal framed it and dive really deeply into like the really specific positionalities and practices that the two of us come from, with the intention of potentially sparking some way to be in dialogue with you all about the places that you're coming from as well. So just wanted to add that since we have like 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Of technology.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's like a real honor and pleasure to be in this space and to be able to present for GYOPO community members. You know, my family also immigrated when I was 7 to Torrance, and so kind of getting a chance to talk in this kind of space is, you know, it's my first time also doing it, so it kind of adds to the specialness of it all. So I will just kind of maybe I'll just give like a brief I'll just tell you guys about the exhibition and the photo book that'll be here, so that you guys can take a look after the presentation. But something that I prepared was a series of photographs that I took in South Korea in the summer of 2023. And a lot of the photographs come from returned US military bases and around the borders of some active ones that are still in Korea as well. And really the photo book that I prepared for here, that is really kind of delving into that and showing you guys photos, which I am more than happy to talk to. And the screen is maybe turning on. Yeah. And so there are also photos on the tables. So those are some of those photos that I took, and I'm more than happy to I think each photo has its own special story, so I can't tell you about all of them today, but maybe when there is some time after the talk, I'm happy to kind of tell you guys about why I might have taken those photos and what their significance is. And I guess like the other thing to say is on the back there is what I'm calling like a people's map of Pyeongtaek. So Pyeongtaek is Pyeongtaek holds the largest U.S. military base outside of U.S. soil in Camp Humphreys, and the lovely illustrations that are there are done by my partner Hae-yoon, who's sitting in the back. So yeah. And okay, so I'm gonna do the first bit without slides. I hope that's okay, but I'm more than happy to share the slides with you guys after. And so, yeah. So today's talk, I titled it Demilitarizing Practices. And the reason that I did that is to kind of give you a sense of how my own creative practice has become aligned with this idea of like, reimagining the Pacific and, producing these alternative Pacific imaginaries. And so to give you kind of some context about how this event became organized, so Kathy, Bz, and I were all pretty shocked when we heard that RIMPAC, or the Rim of the Pacific Exercises, had posted a call for submissions for a 2024 logo design. I think that kind of prompted all of our conversation with each other. And so, as artists, architects, and former designers, I think we all had like this moment of recoil where we're like, oh my God, yeah, creative practice is very much complicit to military violence. And so I also want to say I don't take those words lightly, military violence, but I say it because oftentimes the way that RIMPAC is talked about as either like a war exercise or war game or practice, that tends to kind of emphasize that somehow it's like the opposite from something that's very real, but has something that has real consequences and impact. And so, not only, to give a sense of how I see RIMPAC as of having very real consequences, is that not only is the military the leading contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, but during these coordinated war drills, they often sing ships for practice, which end up damaging underwater ecosystems and animals that reside there. And the continuation of RIMPAC also has more long-term impacts for places like indigenous land in Hawaii, where RIMPAC exercises, are going to be held this year, a couple weeks from now, actually. And the negligent maintenance of military fuel storage facilities and the need for the military to throw out their trash create what are called Superfund sites, which are very much toxified lands. And you'll get to see a glimpse of how those also sort of appear in South Korea as well. And so overall, the continuation of these RIMPAC exercises, not just talking about that one event, but like the long trajectory of events that have happened, they contribute to kind of making land unfit for human living. And so I thought it was really important to think about what that militarized view means and the way that it presents itself, especially in just design and aesthetics. And so a few months after we kind of had this conversation, oh my God, there's design submissions for a RIMPAC logo, we saw the actual logo. So someone did, I think there was 47 submissions, and so there was a winner, and there's actually this crazy write-up about the logo itself that I literally found a couple of days ago, and I was just what is going on? But anyways, and so I wanted to show you that logo and kind of tell you guys about the kind of tropes that it uses about the Pacific. And so firstly, I think as Crystal mentioned, it uses that trope of the Pacific as a vacation destination. And so if you look at the RIMPAC logo, it's kind of, it's an octahedron, and inside the middle, there is a very tropical looking sunset that everyone can overlook. And then on the foreground is this very, sharp, edgy, and cool, as in color tone, looking trident. And so, not only does it play off this tropical idea, as the Pacific as a vacation destination, but it also contributes to, the conception that during RIMPAC, it obscures the kind of environmental destruction that is actually happening as a result of RIMPAC, right? And so there was also this very strange text that was quoted from the designer that made it, and basically he was talking about how he used a lot of futuristic blue colors for the logo because there was a growing role of cyber warfare and remote warfare, and he was seeing how that was kind of the next kind of big thing for the U.S. military. And I found that really interesting, the way that he had conceived of that as a militarized view of the future, even though we kind of know, especially from what's going on in Palestine with the genocide, that this is very well being conducted in the present. And so there was this idea that I think in the logo itself, you can see how, it tends to obscure what the militarized presence looks like in the present through all of these tropes, tropes of it being a vacation destination, tropes of the military as growing in the future, even though it's quite large already. And so, and even though, even that small logo can give us an insight into the way military ideology functions, I will say what is it, by imagining, sorry, a little bit harder to do without the without the slides. But I wanted to kind of shift then to talk about what other visual tools the military uses in order to kind of give us a sense of that militarized view of the Pacific. And so, at this point, I really kind of look a lot at maps. And maps are really interesting to me because they give you a rich visual sense of how space is imagined. But also, when we think about maps and the way that it's used, it's also about how people orient themselves, right? So how does, maps, we use maps to orient ourselves to the environment. And in that sense, we can see how the the U.S. military might orient themselves to a place like the Pacific. And so the map I wanted to show you guys is a map that was included in a CRS report, which is like a Congressional Research Service report for the government by military analysts in March of 2024. And you can see how the Pacific as a body of water appears empty, while the dots that are amassed on the edge of the Pacific indicates all of the US bases that are on foreign soil. So to give you guys an idea of like how many US bases are on foreign soil, we have around 40 military bases, US military bases in Korea still. There's a bunch in Okinawa. And even in the Philippines, they just signed a new contract to allow for US military personnel to land, even though the original Mutual Defense Treaty had already been taken out. And so, that does not include Guam, Marshall Islands, and other locations where the U.S. has like a neo-colonial relationship with. And so, what I wanted to show you guys there is that if you see all the bases in the Pacific and you were to draw a dot for each base there is, you could see this kind of crescent shape that is surrounding the outer rim of the Pacific. And so, to show you what that militarized view actually looks like, and that militarized view doesn't show up just in images of military bases, but if you ever take a look at like trade routes in the Pacific. So there was this website I found that actually visualized all of the trade routes in the Pacific. And if you see it, you can see a similar pattern of all of the dots kind of being at the periphery of the Pacific and kind of that Pacific Ocean being very blank. And so these images, not only do they show like US interest, but it does what Crystal was saying in terms of like, making the Pacific Ocean seem like there's nothing there, that it's blank, that there's no, that it's just a body of water. Indigenous scholars like Amy Stillman have talked about this idea of the Pacific Rim and how it became a dominant economic policy discourse in the 70s and 80s. And that, this imaginary has, historical roots in the US, military industrial complex. And so, and so as much as like militarized Pacific imaginaries choose to invisibilize, the Pacific Islands and the relations that they share with the rest of the Pacific, we know that these sites have been crucial for other ways of knowing and mapping the Pacific even. And so one of the examples that I wanted to show you guys is, an alternative map, which are called like stick charts that were produced by people from the Marshall Islands. And I got this image from the wonderful syllabus that on the Trans-Pacific that actually it was for like a critical ethnic studies special issue that Crystal had edited. And in it, you can kind of see a different orientation towards the Pacific. And so I wanted to like take that as an inspiration and kind of like, showing that, even as these more dominant, images of the Pacific tend to prioritize the rim and prioritize economic interests and prioritize military interests, that there are already other ways that people have conceived of that area. And so, and kind of like turning my attention to South Korea, I think like my argument here is kind of, that a lot of the way South Korea understands the Pacific, like as the South Korean state, they kind of uphold this militarized view. And so the examples that I provide for that are that, for example, South Korea participates in RIMPAC. They participated in RIMPAC every 2 years for a long time. And this year they will take on the role of the Deputy Combined Force Maritime Component Commander, which, they're taking a more leadership role within these war exercises. 2 years ago, South Korea deployed its largest ever Navy fleet for RIMPAC, which had increased tensions with China. But also, South Korea contains 40 US military bases on its soil. So it's not just these singular moments that happen every 2 years where the Pacific is imagined as like practice ground or a pretend war zone, but it's able to be constantly viewed this way in the eyes of the government as well as citizens who worry about issues of security on the peninsula. And so the question that I want to ask in my work is, how do we demilitarize our view of the Pacific? And how do we do that from the perspective of like South Korea? And while I acknowledge that, this is actually, an impossible task given the geopolitical realities of where South Korea is situated, I use that question in my practice as a way of kind of starting to envision my work and attempting to reach that horizon. This is just to say that, these are never the answer, but we can try to attempt to kind of get there and try to break through that militarized Pacific imaginary. And so the first work I want to show is called To Wander Around Suspension, and it's in the back, so after you guys can take a look. But it's a photo book that I made, which was based on the photos I took in the summer of 2023, where I went to more than 6 different cities in South Korea that either have active US military bases or have returned, had once active military bases that had since been returned. And kind of what had prompted this decision was a talk I had gone to when I was living in South Korea, where an activist had discussed the history of environmental peacebuilding movements in South Korea. And here I learned how many returned US military bases in Korea had turned into kind of what I call suspended spaces. So they were neither active bases nor redeveloped land, but somewhere that was like stuck in between, and that had been stuck in between for a really long time. So the one I saw like in Chuncheon was, the U.S. military returned the land in 2004, and it's still not under development because of the toxic wastes that's still underneath. And so I wanted to check these locations out for myself and try to see how accessible it is, try to understand what kind of landscape is being produced around the edges. And one of the first things I noticed was how difficult it was to actually get to these locations. And so often if you look on Naver Maps, which is like the map, which is the equivalent to Google Maps in Korea, these locations are blurred or just absent. And a lot of times they say it's due for security reasons, but even in return sites, you will not see any map signal of them. And so many of the photos I took are only possible because of the work I do with the community orgs there, like the Pyeongtaek Peace Center, who knew how to reach these locations because they had been documenting for over a decade, like the environmental harms that are being produced in these parts of South Korea. And so this is kind of the part where I show you the photos and then describe to you what they're doing. But I'm more than happy to have that conversation after. No, it's okay, it's okay. But to kind of like give you guys a highlight or like an overview of the book is that I wanted to show as much how different those spaces were. So each city that I went to, a lot of those lands were in different conditions. Some of them are harder to get to than others. Some of them feel more dangerous than others, even if they have been returned. And so I wanted to try to express as much as I can the kind of uneasiness within the photos of like having to take photos of these places as well. And there are other places like the city of Kunsan where an active military base exists, and when you go there, there have been a lot of like constant rumors about a second domestic airport that's being built there that was going to be used as a U.S. Air Force facility. And so when you go there, you start to kind of notice different speculative investment projects that are happening or that seem to be happening, but you don't really see traces of them there, except for maybe a sign here and there. And so kind of what I was trying to also do was to not just go to these places that were inaccessible, but also go to those places that seem very common and very regular in like an urban setting, but then to kind of think about that from the perspective of, oh, this is only possible because of the militarization that is ongoing in that city. And so how do these military bases connect to urban planning and kind of like city building within South Korea? And so that's something else that I wanted to kind of highlight. And the other work that I brought for you today, which is a new work that I made alongside Hae-yoon, who's a wonderful illustrator, is the People's Map of Pyeongtaek. And for that, if the photo book deals with landscapes which are kind of like hidden or inaccessible or kind of, making those connections, this is more about, it's more about reorienting ourselves to a view of these cities based on how community organizers and residents of the victims of military dispossession understood the city. So one of the really important events that happened in Pyeongtaek was that in 2002, the South Korean government signed a new agreement, a bilateral agreement with the U.S., basically returning a significant portion of U.S. bases back to South Korea in exchange for expansion in the city of Pyeongtaek. So the reason that Camp Humphreys is the largest U.S. Base in the world today is a direct result of this agreement that was made in 2002. And so Camp Humphreys grew 3 times in its size, and that meant that the residents that had lived around those bases, their lands had to be sold. And so from the years 2000 to 2007, there was a very, very intense struggle from farmers and peace activists in order to stop this military dispossession. And, a lot of people historicize kind of the loss that occurred, but also if we think about it, the Camp Humphreys only got fully built in 2018, and it was earmarked to be built in 2011. So if we think about military expansion, they were able to delay the military expansion because of their actions, because of their protests, because of the ways that they resisted, at least 7 years. And so I want to kind of also talk about that in terms of how do we honor that? How do we kind of understand how that had impacted the city itself? And so that's kind of what the People's Map is about. And a lot of the illustrations are from the books that are in the back that the Pyeongtaek Peace Center, which is a community org that I work with, had given to me for my research. And so, so those are some of, and so they're not all the illustrations are not all the photos. So if you want to look at more photos of what happened, they're over there. And so one of the things that I'm working through in that map is basically one of the kind of, the reason why a lot of the times the reason why they say the city accepted to take on the military expansion was because the city had received a special designation as an international peace city, which allowed for the deregulated free economic zoning, which had kind of allowed for foreign investment to come into Pyeongtaek. And so one of the images there is like a semiconductor factory that's being built right now. It's actually going to be the largest semiconductor factory in the world. And that is a direct result of the kinds of, free economic zoning exceptions that the city received in exchange for allowing for these expansions to occur. And so what's really interesting is if you go to Pyeongtaek now, around that semiconductor factory, there are multiple rows of high-rise apartments that have not been sold that are awaiting sale. And this is all kind of, projected by, local municipalities and the federal government, that people will all kind of flock into the city once these factories are built. And, I think community members are much more wary of this because it's not very transparent how many people will actually come to work. And, because of how automated like semiconductor factories are, even though they say it's like this large thing, no one is really sure like whether those seats are going to fill up. So the city is also at this point where it's, these speculative projects are, the results have to kind of show right now, but they're not necessarily showing. And so I want to also give that sense within the map as well, that is also part of the story. Okay, so, sorry. Am I over time?
No, go. All you.
Okay. So this is like a couple photos. You can definitely take a look at the photo book, but I'll just share like maybe 2 photos that I thought were interesting. And so this is like a photo that I took in Pyeongtaek. And although in Pyeongtaek there has been active military expansion, there have been other plots of land that have been kind of sold or returned. And so we were actually, community organized, we actually were going around this area because they were now doing environmental surveys. So we wanted to make sure people were actually there doing those surveys. So we went, and then I saw this road, and what the organizers had told me that, when they first had returned this in 2000, or when they first had promised to return this in 2004, the local municipality started to build a road here, thinking that we're going to get a road to cross across this training ground once we get it back. The training facility was returned in 2019. So that project was obviously abandoned. And so what we noticed was when I went there was already like a farm here owned by like a farmer, and they just had started to use this as like their own gardening bed because they make rice below, and rice you need a lot of water, and the soil has to be very watery, and so you can't really make other crops. And so he's just been taking advantage of this abandoned infrastructure, which I thought was really interesting. And then secondly is, a lot of the return sites that I saw were in Paju, which is on the north-south, which is a city close to the north-south border of Korea. And actually, when the LPP, when the land partnership plan happened, most of the bases that were returned were on the north-south border, which meant that the US military was saying to the South Korean government, we're no longer going to be your buffer zone. And so a lot of the return bases are in those areas. And one of them, which is called Camp Greaves, has been turned into kind of this tourist destination. And so you take this gondola up, and it's quite amazing, like the performance that is involved in this. Because if you look at this photo, like these are military grade fences, but they're not there to they're new ones. So they've kind of built it up again just to kind of add as like an aesthetic so that people can go in and like go into what a base feels like. And so there's like a museum there that a lot of people can go to. But then there's also this youth hostel that only foreigners are allowed to enter that you can sign up for. And usually that's like through schools or universities. I don't know what happens in there, but I just found that interesting that a portion of Camp Greaves is now a youth hostel where God knows what they learn about in there. But yeah, so just to kind of give you the different textures of what these bases might look like. But I think I went over time, so I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That was incredible from Tony. I feel like we should like give you a round of applause. I'll try to keep my comments a little short so we can also chat with everybody. Part of me wants to kind of like also not use my slides now as a challenge because it's sort of like the worst nightmare of people in visual fields to not be able to show you images. But maybe that's just like my own personal issue.
Oh, no, okay.
I should just show you the slides. So I just wanted to start by sort of establishing where I'm coming from. Of course, many of us here are uninvited, very much uninvited guests on Tongva land, but I'm also a semi-invited guest in the GYOPO space as a Chinese diasporic person. And I just want to make a comment about that, which is like, it is so special to me to be able to speak from a Chinese diasporic point of view to a primarily Korean diasporic audience. I was really reflecting on how special that is, because there are things that we see about each other that help us mutually get to an even stronger point of understanding. And I say Chinese diasporic for me as a political identity that is in opposition to national boundaries and imaginaries. So for my portion, I kind of retitled Pacific Imaginaries as Pacific Imaginaries, and that is a little bit sort of, following the questions that Crystal has framed and Tony has kind of demonstrated, of like, what is the Pacific, how big is it, where does it start and end, for instance, and how, and of course, how has it been constructed literally and figuratively, and how might we understand then pasts, presents, and futures of these beloved places that we might call the Pacific. And then I'll do this sort of, with these images by following my own practice. So again, speaking very much from my position, firstly following systems and structures and kind of and including disciplines that I come from, being visual art and architecture. But then a little bit more in like a little squishy place of the personal and intimate. How do these systems and structures show up in our minds and our hearts and our bodies? And then I'll look a little bit at some new work to think about, like, okay, how do we do this and move this forward? And a little bit just to like think about these migrations. I wanted to show sort of like in the yellow is sort of my family's migration from the Shandong Peninsula, which like we can see all from there, across the Yellow Sea, and also the Yellow River Delta. But also I put in an extra squiggle there that I don't always show, which is that part of my family took a different path through the Korean Peninsula to Taiwan, and then also ended up in New York, which is where I grew up. And so there's a lot of kind of even just within one family, and each of the families that are here, I think, can demonstrate that exact sort of like complexity and nuance. So ending up here in Tovangar, or Tongva, Tataviam, Chumash territories that are overlapped in certain ways, and also speaking as somebody who is coming from training in Western art and Western architecture. I like to say that I've been thoroughly disciplined by Western architecture. I want to start with a particular painting where all of these kinds of ideas about diaspora, translation, visualization kind of converge. And this painting, which some of you may be familiar with, is called Qingming Shanghe Tu, and it's by a Chinese painter called Zhang Zeduan. Translated in English, it's along the river during the Qingming Festival. It's about 1,000 years old, and it's about 5 meters long. Now, we share scroll painting, so y'all know about this. And the reason I'm showing you it like this is to kind of demonstrate how illegible it becomes when we try to make it this object in a Western way of seeing, and how we actually need to engage with these types of art objects and ways of seeing is by interacting with it, by unrolling parts of it at a time, or by unrolling all of it and walking around it with our bodies. And that's a very East Asian way of interacting with the ways that we identify and visualize spaces. So, these were choreographed. They were meant to be unveilings, unravelings of a spatial temporal narrative, again, rather than moving in front of a view already fixed. And so for me, trained as an architect, in words more familiar to us, this kind of parallel projection or denju toshi allowed Zhang Zeduan and other East Asian artists to create these expansive, sweeping visual and spatial analyses of class, gender, geography, and daily life with great precision. And I was never taught the Mandarin for this, but actually instead a term that was more familiar to me is Yuzhou, which is in Mandarin literally space and time. And it colloquially uses to mean universe, like 宇宙的奥秘, like mysteries of the universe. Right? And to me, I'm sharing this because it kind of gestures at a cosmology, and again, one that I think we share in this room, that kind of identifies space and time as one continuum, which we can see in the paintings. And then, so yeah, as other scholars have detailed, or we can talk about a little bit more, this kind of thinking and cosmology and worldview, as well as this type of drawing, they kind of not necessarily coincidentally emerge around the same time. And it kind of maybe gestures at why this might have been an interesting way for some of us to draw. And I would hazard a guess that some of the dissonance sort of arises around this moment in the 17th or 16th or 17th century when Jesuit missionaries started to bring this drawing style and this mode of visualizing along the Silk Road, along with silk, along with tea, gunpowder, paper, and spice in what historian Lisa Lowe describes as the intimacies of four continents, these kind of deeply, intimately, spurring the same imperial and colonial encounters across as well the Atlantic in search of another route to India and to China to gold glory, and hastening the expropriation of indigenous and African sovereignty. Only to be documented finally in the writing of this British man, William Farish, who writes in 1822 on isometrical perspective, why this representational tool might be useful in industrializing Britain, as well as claiming authorship without mention of any significance elsewhere, not Korea, not Japan, not China, not elsewhere, cultural or cosmological. And so I wanted to start here and maybe thinking about reflecting on some of the work that Tony was able to show us, and that's kind of behind us in the space, thinking about drawing as a cosmology, especially as becoming displaced over time, and into a tool that has been used by the Western world to describe machines in service of capital. And this isn't to romanticize and therefore to flatten the origins of particular visual technologies, but to, in this moment, I think, give us a little breathing room to the scale of how many kinds of translations, diasporic translations, I might say, have nestled up atop all of us in this room. So, to state simply off the top from that kind of gift I've put on the table, regardless of what we're doing, architects are creating documents that facilitate transitions and translations from one version of space to another version of space. And these documents, by which I mean drawings, specifications, I know there's at least like one architect in here, contracts, schedules, diagrams, photographs, and other visual artifacts. They play an outsized role not only then in the physical construction of these spaces, but also how we remember them, so how we construct them and come up with them as ideas of space, right? So for instance, this Sanborn fire and insurance map from 1919 is one of the only detailed plans of a petroleum plant design available to the public. And significantly, this was not a sort of educational foresight or sort of like, oh, it would be great to think about how people in the future might want to know about this, but actually just simply because of a lucrative desire to assess fire risk and thus insurance value. Or in the case of this Spanish colonial diseño of Rancho San Pablo, which is present-day Contra Costa County, where diseño, or to design, literally means to signify the bounds of settler colonial land theft. And so it's therefore both incredibly powerful and incredibly dangerous, I would say, to make these documents, since the unequal documentation has contributed not only to white supremacist and settler colonial structures and systems, but perpetuated their mythologies and exacerbated their erasures. So Sarah Ahmed writes, you reproduce something by stabilizing the requirements for what you need to survive or thrive in an environment. as architects continue ad nauseum to reproduce certain representations and ideas of space at the expense of the possibility of others. And when I say architects, I mean that in the most broadest sense of that word, the architects of the US military, architects of a genocide. And while their spatial imbalances are indisputably embodied, the scales, forms, and boundaries of these architectures of extraction and occupation are often intentionally obscured and thus difficult to dismantle. So my practice and research thus wonder aloud about both the representations of violence and also the violence of representations by asking questions using and about the tools at hand, right? And so just to share a little bit about the painting that is actually tucked right there, that's of an oil refinery. The first time I saw a real live seeping tar pit, and this is outside Bakersfield, California, where Yokits and Chumash communities have actually used and been in relation to the tar for millennia. I was so surprised at how earthly it looked and sounded and smelled and felt. I had an uncanny desire to taste it too. It was a reminder of what Métis scholar Zoe Todd writes, that oil is kin, that it is not these fossil former beings that are harmful, but the ways that these particular systems and structures extract, process, and then output them as contaminants and pollutants. And architecture's visual strategies can be quite good at seeing and understanding these entanglements at both systems and body scale. So, on the left, we see Western European mineral extraction being depicted in most. It didn't change? Oh, where now? It froze? Okay, so now the challenge begins. It's totally fine. So there in the kind of these 18th century Western European depictions, we can just, this is great to keep that up. Actually, we should just keep that up the rest of it. Of mineral extraction, there's a great level of detail to using the section cut, where we cut through everything to see above and below ground how different labor practices are existing, what kinds of minerals are being extracted. And then today, it's really rare to actually see any of that except as hyper stylized and kind of abstracted or seen from the sky, right? In a top down. The satellite is also originally a military technology in the Western world. So I'm interested essentially in how all of these tools that have these military origins that have then been co-opted by my discipline, architecture, have been used historically to construct, uphold, and reify all these systems and structures of oppression, and how they might instead be used to unveil, imagine, and draw forth futures beyond. And in that sense, if you're catching, there's sort of like a demilitarizing practice approach in Tony's work that I think I tried to sort of like cheekily, but also productively push on, with my co-optation of these same militarized technologies, right? And I started making my own drawings, which again, you can see behind there, which I started calling crude representations. Because in researching these spaces, such as these massive refineries, oil drilling fields, military bases, and other kinds of militarized spaces and industrialized spaces, I found that most of, like Tony and you all, like most of these spaces are not accurately understood and depicted, and that feeds into each other. Our lack of understanding feeds into lack of visualizations and vice versa. And if we're not accurate and precise about the representations of these spaces, we cannot be accurate nor precise about how we hold them accountable or even to dismantle them and build something else. So in the painting that's in this space, there is a beach called Point Melati in Richmond, California, next to the first oil refinery that Standard Oil, now Chevron, built. And if you do a quick Google search of Chevron Richmond, Point Malati Beach, you will quickly assess that these are images and imaginaries that have been constructed as completely separate from each other, right? And so part of my initial challenge to myself was, how do I make that, how do I actually try to see this better? And so a lot of my practice is really about looking and seeing, right? Using some of these tools that I think have been suggested to me in my, what I called earlier, my 10-year durational performance as an architect. You know, I was able to create that painting by pulling from the archives, looking at US Geological Survey maps, looking at NASA data sets and OpenStreetMap data sets, tools that urban planners, architects, and other practitioners will use. I'm like looking at Hannah now, I'm like, yeah, you're using them, and then trying to find a way to use them in a different way, and also and that involved taking like very precise technical information and adding to them, like actually measuring and modeling in 3D and in 2D the refinery tanks and adding that into the data set that I had, and you know, some of what became very clear, and in that painting, which I keep looking at, but you all can't see, is how egregious and how widespread the omission was of this particular oil refinery. And you know, again, I'm following the work of organizations like the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Communities for a Better Environment, and other organizing efforts, including Boycott Chevron, which I brought stickers for y'all for up in Richmond and down here, working to hold that corporation, transnational corporation, responsible, right? So the painting is acrylic on canvas, although more truthfully, I've been referring to it as an oil painting because acrylic paint is a petroleum product. And it is set to a scale, which means that every 1 inch represents 250 feet. So it's a work that uses axonometry, in this case, oblique parallel projection, which we already established is historically like our collective people's thing, later co-opted by Western architecture for military industrial purposes. It's a map that is a landscape painting, that is an engineering scale that comes from a projection that is both East Asian and also Western architecture. And yeah, if that sounds like a mouthful and like a little bit convoluted, I would just say like that probably helps you understand what's going on in my mind all the time. And so, you know, again, the precision and accuracy of a lot of these technologies and ways of seeing and knowing are only as accurate and precise as the data that gets put in. We kind of know that, understand that objectively, but there's still so much storytelling, you know, with maps that get put out by, for instance, nation states and militaries, that, you know, just the act of ourselves looking and seeing for ourselves, I think, in our communities, enables us to resist and push against. So I want to move to, let me see. I want to move to talking a bit about the other couple of works that are there. Sure, yeah. And you know, that was sort of the like system structures. I want to talk about a little bit like the body, like into, you know, the more personal. Thank you. Yay. Thank you. And this one, I might need some help from people in the audience because I know the phrases in Mandarin. You know, huh? I think let's just be done with it. I think I'm happy. I think I might have manifested it because I said I like wanted to be in solidarity with Tony. I was
Thanks.
like, yeah. I think it's really frozen. I don't want to hurt the projector. Okay, so there are a few phrases in Mandarin that in English mean to lose face or to save face. Can I get some like, is there similar in Korean? Like don't be like that. You're gonna like cause me to lose face, right? Or like let me like finish your plate because like so you save face for me. Like these are things that my mother would say to me. And there's a really great film by Alice Wu called Saving Face, where there's like a queer daughter whose dad says something like 我这辈子的脸都被你丢光了, which means you have lost me my entire lifetime's worth of face. So it's like a deep shame. Yeah, deep shame. And so I started to sort of reflect on that, like as a queer Chinese person myself, of like who's like what are these actions that we are saying are happening to my face or your face, and whose face is it to be lost or saved? And in doing so, I sort of was able to actually bridge the work I was doing with the sites of extraction and militarization and industry with sort of finding my way to my particular diaspora's history on this continent. And part of that was looking at those fire insurance maps. I kept seeing one word over and over. It was Chinese. And at every site of extraction, lumber yards, coal mines, rail yards, I just kept seeing these little shacks that are like these little detailed buildings, dwellings that were labeled Chinese. Sometimes it was labeled Chinese female boarding, which indicated places of sex work. Sometimes it said Chinese wash ho, which is really funny, but the HO actually just means house. So like places of domestic labor that were often performed by people who are male presenting of Chinese descent. And so I've been visiting these places and trying to understand them with my body. I've also created a series of works around losing my face, and just sort of having these paper cutouts or ceramic pieces that I would leave to disintegrate into the landscape, basically. And it kind of converged in this moment a few years ago, and there's a book that's over there as well, titled In Case of Fire, that I created on this experience, where I started at the eastern terminus of the first transcontinental railroad, which is in Council Bluffs, Iowa, if you can believe it. It connected to the Missouri River and to the Mississippi, and thus kind of the eastern half of the country. And I drove along what used to be that railroad all the way to the western terminus in the San Francisco Bay. This kind of relates to my question to us all, which is how big is the Pacific, right? So, as the railroad was being used as a settler tool, an infrastructural tool of settler colonization, to forcibly occupy and wage genocidal warfare across westward, Chinese diaspora were being brought eastward to do that work. And this is like a critical, central, foundational acknowledgement that needs to be made by Chinese people in the Americas, is that we were brought here as racialized labor in the wake of the Haitian Revolution and Black people freeing themselves, as a replacement to commit the crimes that were committed on the soil. So that in that context, I'm just like weeping and losing my face and all this stuff. And at a certain moment, I start to realize there's this other phrase, which is to give face. And I just halfway through my journey, I realized that perhaps I was giving face, which 给面子 in Mandarin sort of means to show deference for, to honor, to respect. And so it suddenly switched my mindset from this like loose kind of, and this is a little bit of a trope, but that I'm just bear with me. But from this sort of like, boo-hoo, I'm losing my face, is it my face? Can I save my face? To this sort of like, actually, I'm giving my face. And to these sort of ancestor cousins, people who are not necessarily my immediate blood relatives, but whose experiences mattered and also shape our experiences today through their colonial encounters, right? So all the way back to the Pacific, and I would kind of land that my thoughts about that work by sharing this particular map that I found in the Sanborn Fire Insurance Archives. And again, this sort of my favorite / most cursed set of drawings, maybe after the diseños, because in almost every case of a Chinese diasporic settlement that I have found in the U.S. West, Chinatown was intentionally burned down. Whether by legally or extra legally. Even in the case of the San Francisco earthquake and the fire, I've said before that Chinatown was more on fire than the rest of San Francisco because there were no fire brigades sent to help them, right? So we see this echoed across all of our lineages and stories. And so in every case that I found of a Chinatown burned to the ground, I was able to locate them in these fire insurance maps, these maps that had been ironically created to assess the risk of fire. And there was one particular, and I think that irony is sort of what drove me to create this artist book that sort of strung together these sites along the railroad. And I hope you all take a look when you're able. And there was one day that I found a map that just said 3 words. It said Chinese vegetable garden, and that was just 3 English words, Chinese vegetable garden, almost certainly written by an Anglo-American man. And I very unexpectedly just sort of began to weep because there was almost no other information, but somehow sort of like a seam had been opened for me to think about the lives lived, the love that was loved, right? The seeds that had been planted. And, I wished that I could hear from across that time the Cantonese or the Toisanese that was being spoken, which would be hard for me to understand with my Mandarin even today, right? I wish that I could smell what was there. And it also took me to a place of my very immediate relatives, my mother and her mother, who have both brought with them in their migrations to this country seeds from where they are from, right? So in terms of how big is the Pacific, that sort of is one of my gestures to that, from the personal as well. And I think just for the sake of really bringing Crystal back and kind of getting to talk more about this and hear from folks, and especially if you're drawing, I'm want to see what you're drawing. That I will just actually invite Crystal right now to come back over here if that's okay. And and if you'll sit between us, that would be the best ever.
Well, that was so amazing, both of you. Thank you so much. Just really feel like I need to process and also what you shared to marinate. So just because of time, I think it would make sense for us to maybe take 1 or 2 questions collectively and just sort of be in conversation. But we'll have a reception afterwards. You can circulate. I was also told that GYOPO would, with the permission from our presenters, share images from your presentations sort of on social media, so you can access it that way as well. So with that said, I want to actually open this. Please don't be shy either. This is such a wonderful opportunity just to be in community with each other. So if there are any questions that folks have collectively or individually, I want to create space for that. Don't be shy.
I have a thought.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's just, so about those fire maps, do you know if they were used by arsonists? Right? That would be very interesting.
Yeah. I do not know if they were being used by arsonists, and I'll be brief. They were primarily made by Anglo-American men who were surveying towns and cities across the so-called United States, and then printed in major cities where other Anglo-American men would kind of assess and say, okay, so your building is around these hazards, so we're gonna charge you this much for the insurance. So in that sense, it was sort of a pseudo proto kind of redlining before the 20s, 30s, 40s history, and Chinese laundries and businesses were often marked as hazards. So less so, maybe somebody used it as, maybe an arsonist did use it. I think they would just go and like smell where all the good food was coming from, and then that would kind of be the cue. But yeah.
Other questions?
I kind of wrote it down to like anxiety problems.
Yeah, hell yeah.
So I really love this conversation. It's refreshing to consider Pacific Imaginaries centered in environmental justice and indigenous autonomy. So, you know, a part of me also can't help but think about like Claudia Rankine's racial imaginaries and how that construction of racial imaginaries is kind of inherent within this dynamic. So I was wondering if that's something that y'all would be interested in talking about in terms of how, yeah, if you just have any thoughts about that, you know, and how that relates to more American perspectives of like anti-Blackness or, you know, how nation-state identities come together when we consider like genetic markers or presumptions of genetic markers.
Hell yeah.
Sorry, that's a big question.
I love the question.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I guess like, you know, one thing that comes to mind, you know, when I think about like racial difference in relation to like Korean community here, but also like just in South Korea is, you know, there's this really great article by Monica Kim who talks about, you know, what it had meant during like 1947 when the US military had set up an interim government in Korea. And, you know, there were already people's movements, there were already political organizations in Korea thinking about independence, wanting to build an independent state. And, you know, the interim government had basically, you know, the US interim government was considered, you know, the sovereign by Western, you know, by the UN as like the sovereign entity there. And that process of like taking away sovereignty was based on racial difference. It was based on the fact that what they were saying was that, you know, Koreans couldn't understand what democracy was because, you know, they were colonized, because they couldn't, you know, because the US had liberated Japan. And so that racial difference is definitely present, I think, you know, within that larger history. And, you know, I kind of like, for me at least, like the way that plays into my work is like, you know, that idea of like a deferred subject, one that is deferred from democracy, is also what is happening to the landscape. Like all of these toxified Superfund sites in Korea, you know, the process of actually trying to imagine something different is being deferred through years and years and years of military environmental exploitation. And so for me, that's where kind of, I think my work intersects with that idea of race. But I want to kind of expand on it as well as I kind of continue. Yeah.
I love the bigness of the question because I think, you know, for me, it kind of motivates me to keep grounding my work in sort of like, why are Chinese people even here? Like, why were even brought here? Like, the first Chinese people were brought to Trinidad as sort of like an experiment of like, can this racialized labor force like kind of function in a similar way? Can like Asian bodies function in a similar to African bodies? But can we call it something else? You know, like a secret third thing, right? Mm-hmm. So it helps me think about how to like move between identifying as Chinese, as Chinese diasporic, as East Asian, as Asian, and all of these things mean different things and draw different solidarities between us in ways that I hope to be very politically precise about. And it's because of the ways that we, or speaking for myself, will like be racialized both, like, or, from nationalist projects, as well as from these like older colonial histories, and simultaneously, and all of us, wherever we are, however we are racialized, sort of have to like navigate that every single day, and like in every encounter that we have throughout that day. And I even saw some. This is so like in a way almost a throwaway, but I saw some headline that was like there was somebody made somebody mad on the internet because for AAPI blah 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 month we like included a lot of Asian films, like, and I guess people do this every year as like part of like Asian American whatever highlights, and I had never even thought about that as an issue, but that kind of illustrates a little bit just the small ways that this shows up, where it's like we have to navigate how we are racialized here and imagined by the settler state or the U.S. military empire, et cetera, but also navigate how other people are imagined, and then those imaginaries are conflated. I just spoke to like one tiny bit of the question you posed, so I'm gonna keep thinking about it, but I want to make sure other folks can speak too. But thank you.
I know I saw we have like a few minutes. I saw another hand for a question, so I want to make sure that we're able to do that. Did you want to ask your question and then respond quickly, and then we'll start going?
Yeah, thank you so much. This was seriously so amazing, and I'm thinking about a lot. I'm kind of thinking about your comment, Bz, and like you all could speak to, kind of comparing like your practice of demilitarizing artistic and cultural and I think scholarly practice versus what you self-identified as more of a co-optation of that military practice in your art. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to more about like how you guys see those twin approaches, and how maybe they like inform each other or jet up against each other. Because I just thought that opposition was a really interesting thing that you brought up.
What are the two, demilitarization and what?
Demilitarizing your artistic practice versus co-opting.
Yeah.
Oh, got it.
Well, I also wonder if Crystal, I don't want to put you on the spot either, but if you have any, having seen,
I will add.
Yeah, okay. I guess I am. I think of as somebody who self-identifies as like co-opting various like military and colonial like strategies of visualization. I should speak to that. I think about it constantly, right? Because you can't. Otherwise, I may be creating more harm. The harm of that I was describing. I tend to be someone whose driving question is, what does it do? So like every time I pick up a new skill in my and fold into my style, I'm like, what does it do? What is a plan, a drawing of like from top down that's cut through? What does that do? What is it good for? What does a section show as a different type of drawing? What does a satellite image do? How does it make us feel different? How does it make us understand it differently? What is it good for? What is it not good for? And so I think, to me, I think the reason why Tony and I have become like friends through this process and not enemies is because it's like we can productively ask that question of each other. Like, how does this move the conversation forward? How does this like add a dimension to how we understand what we're looking at? And so that, we live in such a world of contradiction and like, oh my God, I ordered something from Amazon, but then I ate organic. Now what? Right? So I think it's like that, like sitting with the discomfort is a big part of how I'm responding to your question of like, you know what? Ooh, this doesn't totally make sense.
Yeah.
To have all of these strategies at once, but okay. Like, what do we get out of seeing them all together? And yeah.
No, I think the reason why we can keep having these conversations and we can kind of be productive about it is that I think, at least, I don't know, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I think we're both kind of doing, like, reckoning with our own past as designers, as professional kind of makers, that we're making money off, our practice, and trying to figure out what that means and how we can best reckon with that, and whether that is kind of co-opting those skills and co-opting those spaces to do something better, or just like for me, it was a lot of, actually this is like my first showing of any kind of creative work I've done in more than 2 years, partly because I wanted to step away because I wasn't sure what I should be doing with that practice. I wasn't sure how to not be complicit or, make my peace with it almost. And so, and that is to say, I think it's important that we recognize that we're all seemingly having to reckon with this, but that the paths towards reckoning with that can be different, and that actually speaking through that difference might actually be more productive than, kind of saying like, oh, why don't we just do it this way or that way? And so that's where I really appreciate, Bz's work. It's like it inspires me to think a bit differently about my practice as well.
Yeah, and vice versa.
Yeah.
So one thing that I'll just really quickly add is, for me, I don't think about cooptation, demilitarization. I think they're entwined, so it's not like exclusive to one another. I mean, I also think about, for instance, it's sort of what Bz was saying, like we're embedded in these structures. So it's like, what is like the entry point to actually dismantling? It can't really be, it can be from the quote unquote outside, but what does that mean, right? What does that look like? And even when we think about like, what is abolition, right? Think about abolition, a lot of people might think about abolition as like a utopic other, but actually it's like a daily practice, like freedom is a daily practice, right? So how do we think about, this is where I think like practice is so important, right? Mm-hmm. So thank you for both, all the really wonderful questions. Kathy, did you want to add anything else? Okay. Well, we're going to close, but again, thank you so much to Tony and Bz for sharing their brilliant work.